Over the past several months, a claim has been spreading across YouTube and social media insisting that Mel Gibson sat down on camera and revealed a hidden, horrifying truth about Jesus, one supposedly buried for 1,700 years inside something called the Ethiopian Bible. Video after video promises the same thing, that Gibson uncovered a version of Christ so different from what Western Christianity teaches that it changes everything. So what did Mel Gibson actually say? Does the Ethiopian Bible really exist? And if it does, what's genuinely inside it that could possibly generate this much online buzz? The real answer turns out to be far more interesting than the fake one, and it says a lot about how quickly a small kernel of real history can get wrapped in layers of fabrication until almost nothing true is left standing. To understand why this rumor found such fertile ground, it helps to remember just how significant Gibson's original passion of the being dead Christ actually was. Released in 2004, the film became one of the highest-grossing R-rated movies of all time, made almost entirely in Aramaic and Latin with subtitles, and sparked enormous debate among theologians, historians, and religious leaders over its violent depiction of the crucifixion and its faithfulness to different gospel accounts. Gibson funded much of the film himself after major studios passed on it, and its unexpected commercial success cemented his reputation as someone willing to take serious creative and financial risks on deeply religious material most of Hollywood considered too niche or too controversial to touch. That history matters here because it means when Gibson talks about faith, scripture, or his upcoming resurrection film, audiences already have 2 decades of precedent, suggesting he takes this subject matter seriously and researches it deeply, which is exactly the kind of credibility a fabricated quote can quietly borrow from. Let's start with the one piece of this story that is actually verifiable, because it's the thread every single one of these viral videos is quietly pulling on. Mel Gibson has spent years working on a sequel to his 2004 film, The Passion of the Christ, a follow-up focused on the resurrection, a project he has publicly discussed for nearly 2 decades, and has described as far more ambitious and unusual than the original film. In interviews about that project, Gibson has talked about researching Christian tradition broadly, drawing on scripture, apocryphal texts, and theological consultants to shape how he depicts events surrounding the resurrection on screen. That is a real documented fact. Gibson really has spent years deep in research mode for a major religious film, and he really has talked publicly about wanting to depict something unconventional. Nowhere in any verifiable sourced interview, however, does Gibson specifically reference something called the Ethiopian Bible, describe monks guarding secret knowledge in mountain monasteries, or claim to have personally uncovered some suppressed version of Jesus that the Vatican tried to hide. That entire framing appears to be invented, stitched together well after the fact by content creators who took a real, ongoing film project and built an entirely fictional narrative on top of it. To really understand why Ethiopia's Bible looks so different from the one sitting on most Western bookshelves, it helps to understand that there was never one single, universally agreed upon Christian canon handed down all at once from the very beginning. Early Christian communities scattered across the Mediterranean and beyond read a wide variety of religious texts for centuries before any centralized authority formally decided which books counted as official scripture and which didn't. Different. Regional church councils, operating in different centuries and different political contexts, made different decisions about which texts to include, and those decisions were shaped as much by politics, language, and geography as by pure theology. The Western canon most Protestants and Catholics recognize today was largely solidified through councils held in the 4th and later centuries, heavily influenced by the Latin-speaking, Rome-centered church. Ethiopia, geographically isolated and never fully absorbed into that Roman ecclesiastical structure, simply continued its own separate tradition, one that had already incorporated a wider range of Jewish and early Christian texts before Western councils ever finalized their narrower list. Neither tradition is secretly hiding the truth from the other. They're the product of 2 different regions, making 2 different historical decisions about canon formation, centuries apart, largely without direct coordination. Once you start tracing where this specific claim actually originated, the pattern becomes obvious fast. A cluster of YouTube channels, many of them faceless, AI-narrated accounts posting under nearly identical titles, all began publishing videos within roughly the same window of time, each one using slightly reworded versions of the same premise. One version claims the Ethiopian Bible reveals Jesus as a being of blazing light whose voice reverberates through dimensions. Another claims 40 days of Jesus' life were deliberately deleted and only the Ethiopian version preserves them. A third frames it as a bombshell confession, describing Gibson going quiet on camera before supposedly admitting the real story of Christ has been hidden. None of these videos link to an actual interview, a transcript, a news broadcast, or any other primary source where Gibson says these specific words. What they do instead is rely entirely on dramatic narration, ominous background music, and a title formatted to look exactly like a real news headline. A formula that has become almost a signature of this entire genre of religious clickbait content. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely worth understanding, because underneath all of that fabricated framing sits something that is completely real and honestly more fascinating than the fictional version built on top of it. The Ethiopian Bible does exist, and it really is different from the Bible most Western Christians grew up reading. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world, maintains a biblical canon substantially larger than the Protestant, or even the Catholic canon, containing somewhere between 80 and 88 books, depending on which tradition within the church you're referencing, compared to the 66 books found in most Protestant Bibles. That expanded canon includes texts like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and several other writings that were widely read in the ancient world, but ultimately excluded when Western church councils formalized their versions of Scripture centuries later. Ethiopia's isolation, both geographically and politically, allowed these texts to remain part of an active, living religious tradition long after they'd been dropped from canons elsewhere, preserved continuously inside monasteries across the Ethiopian highlands for well over 1,000 years. The Book of Enoch in particular deserves its own explanation, because it's the text most often distorted inside these viral videos. Enoch is an ancient Jewish religious work, written centuries before Jesus was born, that expands heavily on apocalyptic imagery. Official canons, partly over authorship questions, and partly because its imagery didn't align cleanly with the theological direction those councils were formalizing. Ethiopia, however, never excluded it. It has remained continuously read as scripture inside the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition for close to 2,000 years. But here's the detail that gets twisted the hardest in the viral videos, because Enoch is not a biography of Jesus. It was written well before Jesus lived, and its content focuses on angels, cosmic order, and apocalyptic prophecy, not on describing Christ's physical appearance, secret teachings, or a hidden version of his life story. When these viral videos claim the Ethiopian Bible reveals a shocking, different physical description or biography of Jesus specifically, they're taking a real ancient text and assigning it content it simply doesn't contain. Beyond Enoch and Jubilees, Ethiopian Christian tradition also preserves other texts that Western audiences rarely encounter, including the Kebra Nagast, a foundational Ethiopian religious and national epic that traces the country's royal lineage back to a union between the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and describes the Ark of the Covenant eventually being brought to Ethiopia, where the Ethiopian Orthodox Church still claims to this day that the original Ark rests inside a heavily guarded chapel in the city of Axum, watched over by a single lifelong guardian monk who reportedly never leaves the grounds once he takes on the role. Whether or not that specific claim about the Ark's location holds up to historical scrutiny remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate, but the tradition itself is centuries old, deeply woven into Ethiopian national identity, and completely unrelated to the fabricated Mel Gibson claims currently circulating online. It's a great example of how much genuinely fascinating, verifiable mystery already exists inside Ethiopian Christian history without needing to invent anything at all. It's worth pausing here to explain why this particular kind of misinformation spreads so effectively, because it follows a recognizable formula. Start with a real, respected celebrity, someone whose religious film work already carries genuine cultural weight. Attach that celebrity to a real historical artifact most viewers have never heard of, something that sounds exotic and mysterious, purely because it's unfamiliar. Then fill the gap between those two real things with a completely fabricated claim, dressed up using vaguely official sounding language like exposed, suppressed, and hidden for 1,700 years. The viewer's brain does the rest of the work automatically, because two accurate anchor points, a real actor and a real ancient text, lend borrowed credibility to whatever invented claim gets placed between them. It's the exact same mechanic that powers most viral celebrity misinformation, whether it's about a secret Ethiopian scripture or a fabricated tunnel beneath somebody's house. Real details on either end, fabricated content in the middle, wrapped in a headline engineered to feel like breaking news. It's also worth pointing out something about how these specific videos are actually produced, because the production method itself tells you a lot about how seriously to take the content. Many of these channels rely on AI-generated narration, stock or AI-generated visuals of Ethiopian landscapes and ancient manuscripts that may not even depict real locations, and scripts that follow an almost templated emotional arc, opening with a dramatic hook, introducing a celebrity name for credibility, building tension around a supposedly hidden truth, and closing with a vague, unresolved cliffhanger that encourages viewers to comment their own theories rather than offering any concrete, checkable evidence. This isn't investigative journalism repurposed for YouTube. It's a content format optimized the same way clickbait headlines have always been optimized, just now assisted by tools that make producing dozens of these videos across multiple celebrities and multiple ancient texts dramatically faster and cheaper than it would have been even 5 years ago. There's also a financial incentive sitting quietly underneath all of this that's worth acknowledging directly. Videos built around religious mystery and hidden biblical secrets consistently perform extremely well algorithmically because they combine several of the most reliable engagement triggers at once: curiosity, spiritual significance, and a sense of forbidden or suppressed knowledge. Channels producing this kind of content aren't necessarily driven by any specific theological agenda. Many of them appear to be running the exact same script, sometimes literally the same narration structure, with only the specific claim swapped out, applied across dozens of different celebrities and dozens of different ancient texts. Search for similar phrasing attached to other actors, other religious figures, or other supposedly hidden scriptures, and you'll find nearly identical video formats, which is a strong signal that this is a content production strategy, rather than a genuine reporting effort. None of this means Ethiopian Christian tradition itself is anything less than a legitimately rich, historically significant subject worth learning about on its own terms. And honestly, that's the part that deserves far more attention than it usually gets. Christianity arrived in Ethiopia remarkably early, becoming the official state religion in the 4th century, making it one of the very first nations on earth to adopt Christianity at a governmental level alongside Armenia. Ethiopian Christian art, architecture, and manuscript traditions developed largely independent of European influence for well over 1,000 years, producing an entirely distinct visual and theological culture, including the famous rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved directly downward out of solid volcanic rock in the 12th century. Structures so architecturally striking that some later European visitors initially assumed they must have been built with supernatural assistance, simply because they couldn't imagine how medieval builders accomplished it, using the tools available at the time. It's genuinely worth spending a little more time on Lalibela specifically, because it demonstrates just how much real, well-documented wonder already exists inside Ethiopian Christian history without any exaggeration required. The 11 rock-hewn churches there weren't built up out of stacked stone the way most churches are constructed. They were carved downward, straight into solid volcanic bedrock, meaning builders had to excavate an entire structure, walls, windows, doorways, and interior columns, entirely from a single continuous mass of rock, working from the top down rather than the ground up. Local tradition holds that the churches were completed astonishingly fast for their scale, and legend even credits angels with assisting in the construction, a claim historians treat as devotional storytelling rather than literal fact, but one that reflects just how remarkable the achievement genuinely seemed even to the people living centuries closer to when it was built. Pilgrims have traveled to Lalibela for worship for roughly 900 years, and the site remains an active place of Ethiopian Orthodox worship today. Not a sealed museum piece, but a living, breathing part of a continuous religious tradition still practiced daily. Archaeologists and historians who have studied the site continue to debate exact construction timelines and methods, but nobody disputes that it stands today as one of the most extraordinary feats of religious architecture anywhere in the ancient or medieval world, real history that needs no embellishment to earn its place in any conversation about wonders worth knowing. The Ethiopian Bible itself, written primarily in Ge'ez, an ancient liturgical language still used in Ethiopian Orthodox worship today, even though it's no longer spoken conversationally, represents one of the longest continuously maintained biblical traditions anywhere in the Christian world. Manuscripts were hand-copied by monks for centuries, illustrated with distinctive Ethiopian religious art, and preserved inside monastery libraries scattered across the country's rugged highland terrain, some of them built on isolated mountaintops specifically to protect the texts from invasion, theft, and destruction during centuries of regional conflict. That preservation effort is genuinely remarkable on its own, without needing a single invented claim about secret physical descriptions of Jesus attached to it. Texts like Enoch and Jubilees offer real, historically valuable insight into how ancient and early Christian communities understood cosmology, angels, prophecy, and the broader religious world Jesus himself was born into, which is exactly why scholars of early Christianity study them seriously, not because they contain some suppressed biography of Christ, but because they illuminate the theological and cultural context surrounding the New Testament's formation. Before we go any further, if you find this kind of story, the real history underneath the viral noise, more interesting than the fake version everyone's sharing, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you want more of these deep dives. So why does the fabricated version keep spreading despite having essentially no verifiable source behind it? Part of the answer is that Mel Gibson himself is a genuinely polarizing, high-profile figure whose public statements about faith tend to generate outsized attention regardless of context, which makes him an easy face to attach to almost any religious claim, true or invented. Combine that built-in audience interest with a real, ongoing film project that naturally involves deep research into Christian tradition, and you have exactly the kind of ambiguous middle ground where fabricated claims can hide comfortably, close enough to something real that casual viewers have no easy way to immediately recognize the fabrication without doing outside research themselves. Add algorithmically optimized titles built around forbidden knowledge and suppressed truth, and you get a viral content formula that has now been recycled across dozens of nearly identical videos, all pointing back to the same non-existent primary source. It's also worth noting how this specific claim tends to evolve and mutate the longer it circulates, which is itself a telling sign of manufactured content rather than a single, consistent reported story. Some versions claim the Ethiopian Bible reveals Jesus as a blazing, dimension-spanning being of pure light. Other versions focus entirely on a supposed 40 missing days of his life, wrapped around the 40 days between resurrection and ascension that do appear in mainstream Christian tradition, but reframed as content that was deliberately deleted rather than simply summarized differently across different manuscript traditions. Still, others frame it as Gibson personally confessing on camera to some kind of suppressed discovery, using dramatic pauses and vague, unverifiable phrasing designed to sound like a genuine confession rather than scripted narration. A single, real, verifiable news story doesn't usually shapeshift this dramatically across dozens of retellings within the same few months. Genuine reporting tends to converge on consistent details as more sources confirm the same underlying facts. Fabricated viral content does the opposite, drifting further from any fixed anchor point the longer it spreads, because there was never a real sourced event holding it in place to begin with. So where does that leave the actual truth sitting underneath all this noise? Mel Gibson is genuinely working on an ambitious, long-delayed sequel to The Passion of the Christ. And he really has spoken publicly in verifiable interviews about drawing on unconventional religious sources and consulting broadly during his research process. The Ethiopian Bible is a real, historically significant text containing dozens of additional books not found in most Western Bibles, preserved for well over 1,000 years by one of Christianity's oldest continuous institutions. What doesn't exist anywhere in the verifiable record is Gibson specifically citing the text, describing hidden physical details about Jesus, or confessing to uncovering some suppressed, horrifying truth deliberately kept from the public for 17 centuries. That specific claim appears to have been manufactured entirely by content creators who recognized a profitable formula, real celebrity plus real ancient artifact plus invented shocking claim, and applied it the same way dozens of similar channels have applied nearly identical formulas to other celebrities and other obscure historical texts. The real story here honestly deserves more respect than the fake one it's been buried under. A genuinely ancient, richly preserved Christian tradition, maintained continuously for over a millennium in one of the world's oldest Christian nations, offers real historical and theological value entirely on its own merits, without needing a fabricated celebrity quote to make it interesting. The next time, a video promises that a famous actor uncovered some hidden, suppressed truth about a major historical or religious figure. It's worth checking whether that claim traces back to an actual interview you can watch or read in full, or whether it only exists inside dramatically narrated videos that all suspiciously use the exact same structure, the exact same missing sources, and the exact same formula built to generate clicks first and inform second. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too, because this isn't really a story about one actor or one obscure ancient text. It's a story about how an entire category of religious mystery content has quietly become one of the most reliable engagement engines on the platform, recycling the same handful of narrative beats. A suppressed truth, a guarded secret, a celebrity confession, across an almost endless rotation of subjects. Today, it's Mel Gibson and the Ethiopian Bible. Last year, it may have been a different celebrity and a different apocryphal text. Next year, it will almost certainly be someone else entirely, wrapped in the exact same dramatic music and the exact same unverifiable framing. Recognizing that pattern once makes it dramatically easier to spot every single time it resurfaces afterward, no matter which famous name or which ancient manuscript gets pulled into the next version of the exact same formula. And the next time it does resurface, wearing a different celebrity's name and a different ancient text's title, the same simple question will still work just as well as it does right now, which is to ask calmly and without judgment, where exactly is the source?